Chapter 6. I make great progress in my studies. Am caressed by everybody. My female cousins take notice of me. I reject their invitation. They are incensed and conspire against me. Am left destitute by a misfortune that befalls my uncle, Gawky's treachery. My revenge, as I was now capable of reflection, I began to consider my precarious situation, that I was utterly abandoned by those whose duty it was to protect me, and that my sole dependence was on the generosity of one man, who was not only exposed by his profession to continual dangers, which might one day deprive me of him forever, but also, no doubt, subject to those vicissitudes of disposition which a change of fortune usually creates, or which a better acquaintance with the world might produce. For I always ascribed his benevolence to the dictates of a heart as yet undebauched by a commerce with mankind. Alarmed at these considerations, I resolved to apply myself with great care to my studies and enjoy the opportunity in my power. This I did with such success that, in the space of 3 years, I understood Greek very well, was pretty far advanced in the mathematics, and no stranger to moral and natural philosophy. Logic I made no account of. But above all things, I valued myself on my taste in the belles letters, and a talent for poetry, which had already produced some pieces that had met with a favorable reception. These qualifications, added to a good face and shape, acquired the esteem and acquaintance of the most considerable people in town, and I had the satisfaction to find myself in some degree of favor with the ladies, an intoxicating piece of good fortune to one of my amorous complexion, which I obtained, or at least preserved, by gratifying their propensity to scandal, in lampooning their rivals. 2 of my female cousins lived in this place, with their mother, since the death of their father, who left his whole fortune equally divided between them, so that, if they were not the most beautiful, they were at least the richest toasts in town, and received daily the addresses of all the beaux and cavaliers of the country. Although I had hitherto been looked upon by them with the most supercilious contempt, my character now attracted their notice so much that I was given to understand I might be honored with their acquaintance, if I pleased. The reader will easily perceive that this condescension either flowed from the hope of making my poetical capacity subservient to their malice, or at least of screening themselves from the lash of my resentment, which they had effectually provoked. I enjoyed this triumph with great satisfaction, and not only rejected their offer with disdain, but in all my performances, whether satire or panegyric, industriously avoided mentioning their names, even while I celebrated those of their intimates. This neglect mortified their pride exceedingly, and incensed them to such a degree that they were resolved to make me repent of my indifference. The first stroke of their revenge consisted in their hiring a poor collegian to write verses against me, the subject of which was my own poverty, and the catastrophe of my unhappy parents. But besides the badness of the composition, of which they themselves were ashamed, they did not find their account in endeavoring to reproach me with those misfortunes which they and their relations had brought upon me, and which consequently reflected much more dishonor on themselves than on me, who was the innocent victim of their barbarity and avarice. Finding this plan miscarry, they found means to irritate a young gentleman against me, by telling him I had lampooned his mistress, and so effectually succeeded in the quality of incendiaries that this enraged lover determined to seize me next night as I returned to my lodgings from a friend's house that I frequented. With this view, he waited in the street, attended by 2 of his companions, to whom he had imparted his design of carrying me down to the river, in which proposed to have me heartily ducked, notwithstanding the severity of the weather, it being then about the middle of December. But this stratagem did not succeed, for, being apprised of their ambush, I got home another way, and by the help of my landlord's apprentice, discharged a volley from the garret window, which did great execution upon them, and next day occasioned so much mirth at their expense that they found themselves under a necessity of leaving the town, until the adventure should be entirely forgotten. My cousins, though twice baffled in their expectation, did not, however, desist from persecuting me, who had now enraged them beyond a possibility of forgiveness by detecting their malice and preventing its effects. Neither should I have found them more humane had I patiently submitted to their rancor and borne without murmuring the rigor of their unreasonable hate. For I have found by experience that though small favors may be acknowledged and slight injuries atoned, there is no wretch so ungrateful as he whom you have most generously obliged, and no enemy so implacable as those who have done you the greatest wrong. These good-natured creatures, therefore, had recourse to a scheme which conspired with a piece of bad news I soon after received, to give them all the satisfaction they desired. This plan was to debauch the faith of my companion and confidant, who betrayed the trust I reposed in him, by imparting to them the particulars of my small amours, which they published with such exaggerations that I suffered very much in the opinion of everybody, and was utterly discarded by the dear creatures whose names had been called in question. While I was busy in tracing out the author of this treachery, that I might not only be revenged on him, but also vindicate my character to my friends, I one day perceived the looks of my landlady much altered, when I went home to my dinner, and inquiring into the cause, she screwed up her mouth and fixed her eyes on the ground, told me her husband had received a letter from Mr. Bowling, with one enclosed for me. She was very sorry for what had happened, both for my sake and his own. People should be more cautious of their conduct. She was always afraid his brutal behavior would bring him into some misfortune or other. As for her part, she should be very ready to befriend me, but she had a small family of her own to maintain. The world would do nothing for her if she should come to want. Charity begins at home. She wished I had been bound to some substantial handicraft, such as a weaver or a shoemaker, rather than loiter away my time in learning foolish nonsense that would never bring me in a penny. But some folks are wise, and some are otherwise. I was listening to this mysterious discourse with great amazement, when her husband entered, and without speaking a syllable, put both the letters into my hand. I received them trembling, and read what follows. To Mr. Roger Potion, sir. This is to let you know that I have quitted the Thunder Man of War, being obliged to sheer off for killing my captain, which I did fairly on the beach at Cape Tybrune in the island of Hispaniola, having received his fire and returned it, which went through his body. And I would serve the best man so that ever stepped between stem and stern, if so be that he struck me, as Captain Oakham did. I am, thank God, safe among the French, who are very civil, though I don't understand their lingo. And I hope to be restored in a little time, for all the great friends and parliamentary interest of the captain. For I have sent over to my landlord in deal an account of the whole affair, with our bearings and distances while we were engaged, whereby I have desired him to lay it before his majesty, who, God bless him, will not suffer an honest tar to be wronged. My love to your spouse, and am your loving friend and servant to command, while Thomas Bowling. To Roderick Random, dear Rory, don't be grieved at my misfortune, but mind your book, my lad. I have got no money to send you, but what of that? Mr. Potion will take care of you for the love he bears to me, and let you want for nothing. And it shall go hard, but I will see him one day repaid. No more at present, but rests your dutiful uncle and servant till death, Thomas Bowling. This letter, which, with the other, was dated from Port Louis, in Hispaniola, I had no sooner read than the apothecary, shaking his head, began, I have a very great regard for Mr. Bowling, that's certain, and could be well content, but times are very hard. There's no such thing as money to be got. I believe tea's all vanished underground for my part. Besides, I have been out of pocket already, having entertained you since the beginning of this month, without receiving a sixpence, and God knows if ever I shall, for I believe it will go hard with your uncle. And more than that, I was thinking of giving you warning, for I want your apartment for a new prentice, whom I expect from the country every hour. So I desire you will this week provide yourself with another lodging. The indignation which this harangue inspired gave me spirits to support my reverse of fortune, and to tell him I despised his mean, selfish disposition so much that I would rather starve than be beholden to him for one single meal. Upon which, out of my pocket money, I paid him to the last farthing of what I owed, and assured him I would not sleep another night under his roof. This said, I sallied out in a transport of rage and sorrow, without knowing whither to fly for shelter, having not one friend in the world capable of relieving me, and only 3 shillings in my purse. After giving way for a few minutes to the dictates of my rage, I went and hired a small bedroom, at the rate of 1 shilling and 6pence per week, which I was obliged to pay per advance, before the landlord would receive me. Thither I removed my luggage, and next morning got up, with a view of craving the advice and assistance of a person who had on all occasions loaded me with caresses and made frequent offers of friendship, while I was under no necessity of accepting them. He received me with his wonted affability, and insisted on my breakfasting with him, a favor which I did not think fit to refuse. But when I communicated the occasion of my visit, he appeared so disconcerted that I concluded him wonderfully affected with the misery of my condition, and looked upon him as a man of the most extensive sympathy and benevolence. He did not leave me long under this mistake, for, recovering himself from his confusion, he told me he was grieved at my misfortune, and desired to know what had passed between my landlord, Mr. Potion, and me. Whereupon I recounted the conversation, and when I repeated the answer I made to his ungenerous remonstrance with regard to my leaving his house, this pretended friend affected a stare, and exclaimed, "Is it possible you could behave so ill to the man who had treated you so kindly all along?" My surprise at hearing this was not at all affected, whatever his might be, and I gave to understand with some warmth that I did not imagine he would so unreasonably espouse the cause of a scoundrel who ought to be expelled from every social community. This heat of mine gave him all the advantage he desired over me, and our discourse, after much altercation, concluded in his desiring never to see me again in that place, to which desire I yielded my consent, assuring him that, had I been as well acquainted with his principles formerly as I was now, he never should have had an opportunity of making that request. And thus we parted. On my return, I met my comrade Squire Gawky, whom his father had sent some time ago to town, for his improvement in riding, dancing, fencing, and other modish qualifications. As I had lived with him since his arrival on the footing of our old intimacy, I made no scruple of informing him of the lowness of my circumstances, and asking a small supply of money to answer my present expense, upon which he pulled out a handful of halfpence with 1 shilling or 2 among them, and swore that was all he had to keep his pocket till next quarter-day, he having lost the greatest part of his allowance the night before at billiards. Though this assertion might very well be true, I was extremely mortified at his indifference, for he neither expressed any sympathy for my mishap nor desire of alleviating my distress, and accordingly I left him without uttering one word. But when I afterwards understood that he was the person who had formerly betrayed me to the malice of my cousins, to whom likewise he had carried the tidings of my forlorn situation, which afforded them great matter of triumph and exultation. I determined with myself to call him to a severe account, for which purpose I borrowed a sword, and wrote a challenge, desiring him to meet me at a certain time and place, that I might have an opportunity of punishing his perfidy at the expense of his blood. He accepted the invitation, and I betook myself to the field, though not without feeling considerable repugnance to the combat, which frequently attacked me in cold sweats by the way. But the desire of revenge, the shame of retracting, and hope of conquest conspired to repel these unmanly symptoms of fear, and I appeared on the plain with a good grace. There I waited an hour beyond the time appointed, and was not ill pleased to find he had no mind to meet me, because I should have an opportunity of exposing his cowardice, displaying my own courage, and of beating him soundly wheresoever I should find, without any dread of the consequence. Elevated with these suggestions, which entirely banished all thoughts of my deplorable condition, I went directly to Gawky's lodgings, where I was informed of his precipitate retreat, he having set out for the country in less than an hour after he had received my billet. And I was vain enough to have the whole story inserted in the news, although I was fain to sell a gold-laced hat to my landlord for less than half price, to defray the expenses and contribute to my subsistence. Chapter 7. I am entertained by Mr. Crabbe, a description of him. I acquire the art of surgery, consult Crabbe's disposition, become necessary to him. An accident happens. He advises me to launch out into the world, assists me with money. I set out for London, the fumes of my resentment being dissipated, as well as the vanity of my success. I found myself deserted to all the horrors of extreme want, and avoided by mankind as a creature of a different species, or rather as a solitary being. No ways comprehended within the scheme or protection of Providence. My despair had rendered me almost quite stupefied, when I was one day told that a gentleman desired to see me at a certain public house, whither immediately I repaired, and was introduced to one Mr. Launcelot Crabbe, a surgeon in town, who was engaged with two more in drinking a liquor called poppin, composed by mixing a quartern of brandy with a quart of small beer. Before I relate the occasion of this message, I believe it will not be disagreeable to the reader if I describe the gentleman who sent for me, and mention some circumstances of his character and conduct which may illustrate what follows, and account for his behavior to me. This member of the faculty was aged 50, about 5 feet high, and 10 round the belly. His face was as capacious as a full moon, and much of the complexion of a mulberry. His nose, resembling a powder horn, was swelled to an enormous size, and studded all over with carbuncles, and his little gray eyes reflected the rays in such an oblique manner that, while he looked a person full in the face, one would have imagined he was admiring the buckle of his shoe. He had long entertained an implacable resentment against Potion, who, though a younger practitioner, was better employed than he, and once had the assurance to perform a cure, whereby he disappointed and disgraced the prognostic of the said Crabbe. This quarrel, which was at one time upon the point of being made up, by the interposition and mediation of friends, had been lately inflamed beyond a possibility of reconciliation by the respective wives of the opponents, who, chancing to meet at a christening, disagreed about precedence, proceeded from invectives to blows, and were with great difficulty, by the gossips, prevented from converting the occasion of joy into a scene of lamentation. The difference between these rivals was in the height of rancor, when I received the message of Crabbe, who received me as civilly as I could have expected from one of his disposition, and after desiring me to sit, inquired into the particulars of my leaving the house of Potion, which when I had related, he said, with a malicious grin, "There's a sneaking dog." I always thought him a fellow without a soul, enemy, a canting scoundrel who has crept into business by his hypocrisy and kissing the e of every body. Aye, says another. One might see with half an eye that the rascal has no honesty in him, by his going so regularly to church. This sentence was confirmed by a third, who assured his companions that potion was never known to be disguised in liquor, but once, at a meeting of the godly, where he had distinguished himself by an extempore prayer an hour long. After this preamble, Crabbe addressed himself to me in these words. Well, my lad, I have heard a good character of you, and I'll do for you. You may send your things to my house when you please. I have given orders for your reception. Zounds, what does the booby stare at? If you have no mind to embrace my courteous offer, you may let it alone, and be D. I answered with a submissive bow, that I was far from rejecting his friendly offer, which I would immediately accept, as soon as he should inform me on what footing I was to be entertained. What footing? D.N. my blood, cried he, do you expect to have a footman and a couple of horses kept for you? No, sir, I replied, my expectations are not quite so sanguine. That I may be as little burthensome as possible, I would willingly serve in your shop, by which means I may save you the expense of a journeyman, or porter at least. For I understand a little pharmacy, having employed some of my leisure hours in the practice of that art, while I lived with Mr. Potion, neither am I altogether ignorant of surgery, which I have studied with great pleasure and application. Oh ho! You did, says Crabbe. Gentlemen, here is a complete artist. Studied surgery, what? In books, I suppose. I shall have you disputing with me one of these days on points of my profession. You can already account for muscular motion, I warrant, and explain the mystery of the brain and nerves. Ha! You are too learned for me, D, and me. But let's have no more of this stuff. Can you blood and give a clister, spread a plaster, and prepare a potion? Upon my answering in the affirmative, he shook his head, telling me he believed he should have little good of me for all my promises, but however he would take me in for the sake of charity. I was accordingly that very night admitted to his house, and had an apartment assigned to me in the garret, which I was fain to put up with, notwithstanding the mortification my pride suffered in this change of circumstances. I was soon convinced of the real motives which induced Crabbe to receive me in this manner. For, besides the gratification of his revenge, by exposing the selfishness of his antagonist, in opposition to his own generosity, which was all affectation, he had occasion for a young man who understood something of the profession, to fill up the place of his eldest apprentice, lately dead, not without violent suspicion of foul play from his master's brutality. The knowledge of this circumstance, together with his daily behavior to his wife and the young apprentice, did not at all contribute to my enjoying my new situation with ease. However, as I did not perceive how I could bestow myself to better advantage, I resolved to study Crabbe's temper with all the application, and manage it with all the address in my power. And it was not long before I found out a strange peculiarity of humor, which governed his behavior towards all his dependents. I observed, when he was pleased, he was such a niggard of his satisfaction that, if his wife or servants betrayed the least symptom of participation, he was offended to an insupportable degree of choler and fury, the effects of which they seldom failed to feel. And when his indignation was roused, submission and soothing always exasperated it beyond the bounds of reason and humanity. I therefore pursued a contrary plan, and one day, when he honored me with the names of ignorant whelp and lazy ragamuffin, I boldly replied, I was neither ignorant nor lazy, since I both understood and performed my business as well as he could do for his soul. Neither was it just to call me ragamuffin, for I had a whole coat on my back and was descended from a better family than any he could boast an alliance with. He gave tokens of great amazement at this assurance of mine, and shook his cane over my head, regarding me all the time with a countenance truly diabolical. Although I was terribly startled at his menacing looks and posture, I yet had reflection enough left to convince me I had gone too far to retract, and that this was the critical minute which must decide my future lot in his service. I therefore snatched up the pestle of a mortar, and swore, if he offered to strike me without a cause, I should see whether his skull or my weapon was hardest. He continued silent for some time, and at last broke forth into these ejaculations. "This is fine usage from a servant to his master, very fine. Damnation. But no matter, you shall pay for this, you dog, you shall. I'll do your business. Yes, yes, I'll teach you to lift your hand against me." So saying, he retired and left me under dreadful apprehensions, which vanished entirely at our next meeting, when he behaved with unusual complacency and treated me with a glass of punch after dinner. By this conduct, I got the ascendancy over him in a short time, and became so necessary to him, in managing his business while he was engaged at the bottle, that fortune began to wear a kinder aspect, and I consoled myself for the disregard of my former acquaintance, with the knowledge I daily imbibed by a close application to the duties of my employment, in which I succeeded beyond my own expectation. I was on very good terms with my master's wife, whose esteem I acquired and cultivated by representing Mrs. Potion in the most ridiculous lights my satirical talents could invent, as well as by rendering her some Christian offices, when she had been too familiar with the dram bottle, to which she had oftentimes recourse for consolation, under the affliction she suffered from a barbarous husband. In this manner I lived, without hearing the least tidings of my uncle for the space of 2 years, during which time I kept little or no company, being neither in a humor to relish nor in a capacity to maintain much acquaintance. For the nabal my master allowed me no wages, and the small perquisites of my station scarcely supplied me with the common necessaries of life. I was no longer a pert, unthinking coxcomb, giddy with popular applause, and elevated with the extravagance of hope. My misfortunes had taught me how little the caresses of the world, during a man's prosperity, are to be valued by him, and how seriously and expeditiously he ought to set about making himself independent of them. My present appearance, therefore, was the least of my care, which was wholly engrossed in laying up a stock of instruction that might secure me against the caprice of fortune for the future. I became such a sloven, and contracted such an air of austerity, that everybody pronounced me crestfallen, and Gawky returned to town without running any risk from my resentment, which was by this time pretty much cooled, and restrained by prudential reasons so effectually that I never so much as thought of obtaining satisfaction for the injuries he had done me. When I deemed myself sufficiently master of my business, I began to cast about for an opportunity of launching into the world, in hope of finding some provision that might make amends for the difficulties I had undergone. But, as this could not be effected without a small sum of money to equip me for the field, I was in the utmost perplexity how to raise it, well knowing that Crabbe, for his own sake, would never put me in a condition to leave him, when his interest was so much concerned in my stay. But a small accident, which happened about this time, determined him in my favor. This was no other than the pregnancy of his maidservant, who declared her situation to me, assuring me at the same time that I was the occasion of it. Although I had no reason to question the truth of this imputation, I was not ignorant of the familiarities which had passed between her master and her, taking the advantage of which I represented to her the folly of laying the burden at my door, when she might dispose of it to much better purpose with Mr. Crab. She listened to my advice, and next day acquainted him with the pretended success of their mutual endeavors. He was far from being overjoyed at this proof of his vigor, which he foresaw might have very troublesome consequences. Not that he dreaded any domestic grumblings and reproaches from his wife, whom he kept in perfect subjection, but because he knew it would furnish his rival potion with a handle for insulting and undermining his reputation, there being no scandal equal to that of uncleanness, in the opinion of those who inhabit the part of the island where he lived. He therefore took a resolution worthy of himself, which was to persuade the girl that she was not with child, but only afflicted with a disorder incidental to young women, which he could easily remove. With this view, as he pretended, he prescribed for her such medicines as he thought would infallibly procure abortion. But in this scheme he was disappointed, for the maid, being advertised by me of his design, and at the same time well acquainted with her own condition, absolutely refused to follow his directions, and threatened to publish her situation to the world if he would not immediately take some method of providing for the important occasion, which she expected in a few months. It was not long before I guessed the result of his deliberation, by his addressing himself to me one day in this manner. "I am surprised that a young fellow like you discovers no inclination to push his fortune in the world. Before I was of your age, I was broiling on the coast of Guinea. What's to hinder you from profiting by the war which will certainly be declared in a short time against Spain? You may easily get on board of a king's ship in quality of surgeon's mate, where you will certainly see a great deal of practice, and stand a good chance of getting prize money." I laid hold of this declaration, which I had long wished for, and assured him I would follow his advice with pleasure, if it were in my power, but that it was impossible for me to embrace an opportunity of that kind, as I had no friend to advance a little money to supply me with what necessaries I should want, and defray the expenses of my journey to London. He told me that few necessaries were required, and as for the expense of my journey, he would lend me money, sufficient not only for that purpose, but also to maintain me comfortably in London until I should procure a warrant for my provision on board of some ship. I gave him 1,000 thanks for his obliging offer, although I was very well apprised of his motive, which was no other than a design to lay the bastard to my charge after my departure, and accordingly set out in a few weeks for London, my whole fortune consisting of 1 suit of clothes, 6 ruffled shirts, as many plain, 2 pair of worsted and a like number of threaded stockings, a case of pocket instruments, a small edition of Horace Weissmann's Surgery, and 10 guineas in cash, for which Crabbe took my bond, bearing 5% interest, at the same time giving me a letter to a member of Parliament for our town, which he said would do my business effectually. Chapter 8. I arrive at Newcastle, meet with my old schoolfellow Strap. We determine to walk together to London, set out on our journey, put up at a solitary alehouse, are disturbed by a strange adventure in the night. There is no such convenience as a wagon in this country, and my finances were too weak to support the expense of hiring a horse. I determined therefore to set out with the carriers, who transport goods from one place to another on horseback. And this scheme I accordingly put in execution on the 1st day of September, 1739, sitting upon a pack saddle between 2 baskets, one of which contained my goods in a knapsack. But by the time we arrived at Newcastle upon Tyne, I was so fatigued with the tediousness of the carriage, and benumbed with the coldness of the weather, that I resolved to travel the rest of my journey on foot, rather than proceed in such a disagreeable manner. The ostler of the inn at which we put up, understanding I was bound for London, advised me to take my passage in a collier which would be both cheap and expeditious, and withal much easier than to walk upwards of 300 miles through deep roads in the winter time, a journey which he believed I had not strength enough to perform. I was almost persuaded to take his advice, when one day, stepping into a barber's shop to be shaved, the young man, while he lathered my face, accosted me thus: "Sir, I presume you are a Scotchman." I answered in the affirmative. "Pray," continued he, "from what part of Scotland?" I no sooner told him than he discovered great emotion, and not confining his operation to my chin and upper lip, besmeared my whole face with great agitation. I was so offended at this profusion that, starting up, I asked him what the d—l he meant by using me so. He begged pardon, telling me his joy at meeting with a countryman had occasioned some confusion in him, and craved my name. But when I declared my name was Random, he exclaimed in rapture, "How?" "Rory Random." "The same," I replied, looking at him with astonishment. "What?" cried he. "Don't you know your old schoolfellow, Hugh Strap?" At that instant, recollecting his face, I flew into his arms, and in the transport of my joy, gave him back one half of the suds he had so lavishly bestowed on my countenance, so that we made a very ludicrous appearance, and furnished a great deal of mirth for his master and shopmates, who were witnesses of this scene. When our mutual caresses were over, I sat down again to be shaved, but the poor fellow's nerves were so discomposed by this unexpected meeting that his hand could scarcely hold the razor, with which, nevertheless, he found means to cut me in 3 places in as many strokes. His master, perceiving his disorder, bade another supply his place, and after the operation was performed, gave Strap leave to pass the rest of the day with me. We retired immediately to my lodgings, where, calling for some beer, I desired to be informed of his adventures, which contained nothing more than that his master dying before his time was out. He had come to Newcastle about a year ago, in expectation of journey work, along with 3 young fellows of his acquaintance who worked in the keels. That he had the good fortune of being employed by a very civil master, with whom he intended to stay till the spring, at which time he proposed to go to London, where he did not doubt of finding encouragement. When I communicated to him my situation and design, he did not approve of my taking a passage by sea by reason of the danger of a winter voyage, which is very hazardous along that coast, as well as the precariousness of the wind, which might possibly detain me a great while, to the no small detriment of my fortune. Whereas, if I would venture by land, he would bear me company, carry my baggage all the way, and if we should be fatigued before we could perform the journey, it would be no hard matter for us to find on the road either return horses or wagons, of which we might take the advantage for a very trifling expense. I was so ravished at this proposal that I embraced him affectionately, and assured him he might command my purse to the last farthing. But he gave me to understand he had saved money sufficient to answer his own occasions, and that he had a friend in London who would soon introduce him into business in that capital, and possibly have it in his power to serve me also. Having concerted the plan and settled our affairs that night, we departed next morning by daybreak, armed with a good cudgel each, my companion being charged with the furniture of us both crammed into one knapsack, and our money sewed between the linings and waistbands of our breeches, except some loose silver for our immediate expenses on the road. We traveled all day at a round pace, but being ignorant of the proper stages, were benighted at a good distance from any inn, so that we were compelled to take up our lodging at a small hedge alehouse that stood on a by-road, about half a mile from the highway. There we found a peddler of our own country, in whose company we regaled ourselves with bacon and eggs, and a glass of good ale, before a comfortable fire, conversing all the while very sociably with the landlord and his daughter, a hale, buxom lass, who entertained us with great good humor, and in whose affection I was vain enough to believe I had made some progress. About 8 o'clock, we were all three, at our own desire, shown into an apartment furnished with 2 beds, in one of which Strap and I betook ourselves to rest, and the peddler occupied the other, though not before he had prayed a considerable time extempore, searched into every corner of the room, and fastened the door on the inside with a strong iron screw, which he carried about with him for that use. I slept very sound till midnight, when I was disturbed by a violent motion of the bed, which shook under me with a continual tremor. Alarmed at this phenomenon, I jogged my companion, whom, to my no small amazement, I found drenched in sweat and quaking through every limb. He told me with a low, faltering voice that we were undone, for there was a bloody highwayman, loaded with pistols, in the next room. Then, bidding me make as little noise as possible, he directed me to a small chink in the board partition through which I could see a thick-set, brawny fellow, with a fierce countenance, sitting at a table with our young landlady, having a bottle of ale and a brace of pistols before him. I listened with great attention, and heard him say in a terrible tone, "D, and that son of a B.H. smack the coachman. He has served me a fine trick indeed. But D, iron seize me if I don't make him repent it. I'll teach the scoundrel to give intelligence to others while he is under articles with me." Our landlady endeavored to appease this exasperated robber by saying he might be mistaken in Smack, who perhaps kept no correspondence with the other gentleman that robbed his coach, and that, if an accident had disappointed him today, he might soon find opportunities enough to atone for his lost trouble. "I'll tell thee what, my dear Bet," replied he, "I never had, nor ever shall, while my name is Rifle, have such a glorious booty as I missed today. Z.S. There was £400 in cash to recruit men for the king's service, besides the jewels, watches, swords, and money belonging to the passengers. Had it been my fortune to have got clear off with so much treasure, I would have purchased a commission in the army and made you an officer's lady, you jade, I would." "Well, well," cries Betty, "we must trust to Providence for that. But did you find nothing worth taking which escaped the other gentlemen of the road?" "Not much, faith," said the lover. "I gleaned a few things, such as a pair of pops, silver-mounted, here they are. I took them loaded from the captain who had the charge of the money, together with a gold watch which he had concealed in his breeches. I likewise found 10 Portugal pieces in the shoes of a Quaker, whom the spirit moved to revile me with great bitterness and devotion. But what I value myself mostly for is this here purchase, a gold snuff-box, my girl, with a picture on the inside of the lid, which I untied out of the tail of a pretty lady's smock. Here, as the devil would have it, the peddler snored so loud that the highwayman, snatching his pistols, started up, crying, 'Hell and DNN. I am betrayed. Who's that in the next room? Mrs. Betty told him he need not be uneasy. There were only 3 poor travelers, who, missing the road, had taken up their lodgings in the house, and were asleep long ago. "Travelers," says he, "spies you be, CH. But no matter, I'll send them all to hell in an instant." He accordingly ran towards our door, when his sweetheart, interposing, assured him there was only a couple of poor young Scotchmen, who were too raw and ignorant to give him the least cause of suspicion, and the third was a Presbyterian peddler of the same nation, who had often lodged in the house before. This declaration satisfied the thief, who swore he was glad there was a peddler, for he wanted some linen. Then, in a jovial manner, he put about the glass, mingling his discourse to Betty with caresses and familiarities that spoke him very happy in his amours. During that part of the conversation which regarded this, Strap had crept under the bed, where he lay in the agonies of fear, so that it was with great difficulty I persuaded him our danger was over, and prevailed on him to awake the peddler, and inform him of what he had seen and heard. The itinerant merchant no sooner felt somebody shaking him by the shoulder than he started up, called as loud as he could, "Thieves, thieves! Lord have mercy upon us!" And Rifle, alarmed at this exclamation, jumped up, cocked one of his pistols, and turned towards the door to kill the first man that should enter. For he verily believed himself beset, when his Dulcinea, after an immoderate fit of laughter, persuaded him that the poor peddler, dreaming of thieves, had only cried out in his sleep. Meanwhile, my comrade had undeceived our fellow lodger, and informed him of his reason for disturbing him. Upon which, getting up softly, he peeped through the hole, and was so terrified with what he saw, that, falling down on his bare knees, he put up a long petition to heaven to deliver him from the hands of that ruffian, and promised never to defraud a customer for the future of the value of a pin's point, provided he might be rescued from the present danger. Whether or not his disburthening his conscience afforded him any ease I knew not, but he slipped into bed again, and lay very quiet until the robber and his mistress were asleep, and snored in concert. Then, rising softly, he untied a rope that was round his pack, which making fast to one end of it, he opened the window with as little noise as possible, and lowered his goods into the yard with great dexterity. Then he moved gently to our bedside and bade us farewell, telling us that, as we ran no risk, we might take our rest with great confidence, and in the morning assure the landlord that we knew nothing of his escape, and lastly, shaking us by the hands, and wishing us all manner of success, he let himself drop from the window without any danger, for the ground was not above a yard from his feet as he hung on the outside. Although I did not think proper to accompany him in his flight, I was not at all free from apprehension when I reflected on what might be the effect of the highwayman's disappointment, as he certainly intended to make free with the peddler's ware. Neither was my companion at more ease in his mind, but on the contrary, so possessed with the dreadful idea of Rifle that he solicited me strongly to follow our countryman's example, and so elude the fatal resentment of that terrible adventurer, who would certainly wreak his vengeance on us as accomplices of the peddler's elopement. But I represented to him the danger of giving Rifle cause to think we know his profession, and suggested that, if ever he should meet us again on the road, he would look upon us as dangerous acquaintance, and find it his interest to put us out of the way. I told him, withal, my confidence in Betty's good nature, in which he acquiesced, and during the remaining part of the night we concerted a proper method of behavior to render us unsuspected in the morning. It was no sooner day than Betty, entering our chamber and perceiving our window open, cried out, "Odds bobs! Sure you Scotchmen must have hot constitutions to lie all night with the window open in such cold weather." I feigned to start out of sleep, and withdrawing the curtain, called, "What's the matter?" When she showed me, I affected surprise and said, "Bless me." The window was shut when we went to bed. "I'll be hanged," said she, "if Sawney Waddle the peddler has not got up in a dream and done it, for I heard him very obstropulous in his sleep. Sure I put a chamber pot under his bed." With these words she advanced to the bed, in which he lay, and finding the sheets cold, exclaimed, "Good lackadaisy! The rogue is fled." "Fled," cried I with feigned amazement, "God forbid. Sure he has not robbed us." Then, springing up, I laid hold of my breeches and emptied all my loose money into my hand, which having reckoned, I said, "Heaven be praised, our money is all safe." Strap looked to the knapsack. He did so, and found all was right. Upon which we asked, with seeming concern, if he had stolen nothing belonging to the house. "No, no," replied she, "he has stole nothing but his reckoning," which, it seems, this pious peddler had forgot to discharge in the midst of his devotion. Betty, after a moment's pause, withdrew, and immediately we could hear her waken Rifle, who no sooner heard of Waddle's flight than he jumped out of bed and dressed, venting 1,000 execrations, and vowing to murder the peddler if ever he should set eyes on him again. "For," said he, "the scoundrel has by this time raised the hue and cry against me." Having dressed himself in a hurry, he mounted his horse, and for that time rid us of his company and 1,000 fears that were the consequence of it. While we were at breakfast, Betty endeavored, by all the cunning she was mistress of, to learn whether or no we suspected our fellow lodger, whom we saw take horse. But, as we were on our guard, we answered her sly questions with a simplicity she could not distrust, when all of a sudden we heard the trampling of a horse's feet at the door. This noise alarmed Strap so much, whose imagination was wholly engrossed by the image of Rifle, that, with a countenance as pale as milk, he cried, "O Lord!" "There is the highwayman returned." Our landlady, staring at these words, said, "What highwayman, young man? Do you think any highwaymen harbor here?" Though I was very much disconcerted at this piece of indiscretion in Strap, I had presence of mind enough to tell her we had met a horseman the day before, whom Strap had foolishly supposed to be a highwayman because he rode with pistols, and that he had been terrified at the sound of a horse's feet ever since. She forced a smile at the ignorance and timidity of my comrade, but I could perceive, not without great concern, that this account was not at all satisfactory to her. Chapter 9. We proceed on our journey, are overtaken by a highwayman who fires at Strap, is prevented from shooting me by a company of horsemen, who ride in pursuit of him. Strap is put to bed at an inn, adventures at that inn after having paid our score and taken leave of our hostess, who embraced me tenderly at parting. We proceeded on our journey, blessing ourselves that we had come off so well. We had not walked above 5 miles, when we observed a man on horseback galloping after us, whom we in a short time recognized to be no other than this formidable hero, who had already given us so much vexation. He stopped hard by me, and asked if I knew who he was. My astonishment had disconcerted me so much that I did not hear his question, which he repeated with a volley of oaths and threats, but I remained as mute as before. Strap, seeing my discomposure, fell upon his knees in the mud, uttering with a lamentable voice these words, "For Christ's sake, have mercy upon us, mister." "Rifle, we know you very well." "Oh ho," cried the thief, "you do. But you never shall be evidence against me in this world, you dog." So saying, he drew a pistol, and fired it at the unfortunate shaver, who fell flat upon the ground without speaking one word. My comrade's fate and my own situation riveted me to the place where I stood, deprived of all sense and reflection, so that I did not make the least attempt either to run away or deprecate the wrath of this barbarian, who snapped a second pistol at me. But before he had time to prime again, perceiving a company of horsemen coming up, he rode off, and left me standing motionless as a statue, in which posture I was found by those whose appearance had saved my life. This company consisted of 3 men in livery, well armed, with an officer, who, as I afterwards learned, was the person from whom Rifle had taken the pocket pistols the day before, and who, making known his misfortune to a nobleman he met on the road, and assuring him his non-resistance was altogether owing to his consideration for the ladies in the coach, procured the assistance of his lordship's servants to go in quest of the plunderer. This holiday captain scampered up to me with great address, and asked who fired the pistol which he had heard. As I had not yet recovered my reason, he, before I could answer, observed a body lying on the ground, at which sight his color changed, and he pronounced with a faltering tongue, "Gentlemen, here's murder committed." "Let us alight." "No, no," said one of his followers, "let us rather pursue the murderer." "Which way went he, young man?" By this time, I had recollected myself so far as to tell them that he could not be a quarter of a mile before, and to beg one of them to assist me in conveying the corpse of my friend to the next house, in order to it being interred. The captain, foreseeing that, in case he should pursue, he must soon come to action, began to curb his horse and gave him the spur at the same time, which treatment making the creature rear up and snort, he called out his horse was frightened and would not proceed, at the same time wheeling him round and round, stroking his neck, whistling and wheedling him with "Sirrah, sirrah, gently, gently," etc. "ZDS," cried one of the servants, "sure my lord's sorrel is not resty." With these words he bestowed a lash on his buttocks, and Sorrel, disdaining the rein, sprang forward with the captain at a pace that would have soon brought him up with the robber, had not the girth, happily for him, given way, by which means he landed in the dirt, and two of his attendants continued their pursuit without minding his situation. Meanwhile, one of the three who remained at my desire, turning the body of Strap, in order to see the wound which had killed him, found him still warm and breathing. Upon which I immediately let him blood, and saw him, with inexpressible joy, recover, he having received no other wound than what his fear had inflicted. Having raised him upon his legs, we walked together to an inn, about half a mile from the place, where Strap, who was not quite recovered, went to bed. And in a little time the third servant returned with the captain's horse and furniture, leaving him to crawl after as well as he could. This gentleman of the sword, upon his arrival, complained grievously of the bruise occasioned by his fall, and on the recommendation of the servant, who warranted my ability, I was employed to bleed him, for which service he rewarded me with 1/2 crown. The time between this event and dinner I passed in observing a game at cards between two farmers, an exciseman, and a young fellow in a rusty gown and cassock, who, as I afterwards understood, was curate of a neighboring parish. It was easy to perceive that the match was not equal, and that the two farmers, who were partners, had to do with a couple of sharpers, who stripped them of all their cash in a very short time. But what surprised me very much was to hear this clergyman reply to one of the countrymen, who seemed to suspect foul play, in these words: "D, and me, friend, d'ye question my honor?" I did not at all wonder to find a cheat in canonicals, this being a character frequent in my own country, but I was scandalized at the indecency of his behavior, which appeared in the oaths he swore and the bawdy songs which he sung. At last, to make amends in some sort for the damage he had done to the unwary boors, he pulled out a fiddle from the lining of his gown, and, promising to treat them at dinner, began to play most melodiously, singing in concert all the while. This good humor of this parson inspired the company with so much glee that the farmers soon forgot their losses, and all present went to dancing in the yard. While we were agreeably amused in this manner, our musician, spying a horseman a-riding towards the inn, stopped all of a sudden, crying out, "Gadso! Gentlemen, I beg your pardon, there's our dog of a doctor coming into the inn." He immediately commended his instrument and ran towards the gate, where he took hold of the vicar's bridle and helped him off, inquiring very cordially into the state of his health. This rosy son of the church, who might be about the age of 50, having alighted and entrusted the curate with his horse, stalked with great solemnity into the kitchen, where, sitting down by the fire, he called for a bottle of ale and a pipe, scarce deigning an answer to the submissive questions of those who inquired about the welfare of his family. While he indulged himself in this state, amidst a profound silence, the curate, approaching him with great reverence, asked him if he would not be pleased to honor him with his company at dinner. To which interrogation he answered in the negative, saying he had been to visit Squire Bumpkin, who had drank himself into a high fever at the last assizes, and that he had, on leaving his own house, told Betty he should dine at home. Accordingly, when he had made an end of his bottle and pipe, he rose and moved with prelatical dignity to the door, where his journeyman stood ready with his nag. He had no sooner mounted than the facetious curate, coming into the kitchen, held forth in this manner. There the old rascal goes, and the D.L. go with him. You see how the world wags, gentlemen. By gad, this rogue of a vicar does not deserve to live, and yet he has 2 livings worth £400 per annum, while poor I am fain to do all his drudgery, and ride 20 miles every Sunday to preach. For what? Why, truly, for £20 a year. I scorn to boast of my own qualifications, but comparisons are odious. I should be glad to know how this wag-bellied doctor deserves to be more at ease than me. He can loll in his elbow chair at home, indulge himself in the best of victuals and wine, and enjoy the conversation of Betty, his housekeeper. You understand me, gentlemen. Betty is the doctor's poor kinswoman, and a pretty girl she is, but no matter for that. I, and dutiful girl to her parents, whom she visits regularly every year, though I must own I could never learn in what county they live, my service T.I., gentlemen. By this time, dinner being ready, I waked my companion, and we ate all together with great cheerfulness. When our meal was ended, and every man's share of the reckoning adjusted, the curate went out on pretense of some necessary occasion, and, mounting his house, left the 2 farmers to satisfy the host in the best manner they could. We were no sooner informed of this piece of finesse than the exciseman, who had been silent hitherto, began to open with a malicious grin. Aye, this is an old trick of Shuffle. I could not help smiling when he talked of treating. You must know this is a very curious fellow. He picked up some scraps of learning, while he served young Lord Trift at the university. But what he most excels in is pimping. No one knows his talents better than I, for I was valet-de-chamber to Squire Tattle, an intimate companion of Shuffle's lord. He got himself into a scrape by pawning some of his lordship's clothes, on which account he was turned away. But, as he was acquainted with some particular circumstances of my lord's conduct, he did not care to exasperate him too much, and so made interest for his receiving orders, and afterwards recommended him to the curacy which he now enjoys. However, the fellow cannot be too much admired for his dexterity in making a comfortable livelihood, in spite of such a small allowance. You hear he plays a good stick, and is really diverting company. These qualifications make him agreeable wherever he goes. And, as for playing at cards, there is not a man within 3 counties for him. The truth is, he is a able cheat, and can shift a card with such address that it is impossible to discover him. Here he was interrupted by one of the farmers, who asked why he had not justice enough to acquaint them with these particulars before they engaged in play. The exciseman replied, without any hesitation, that it was none of his business to intermeddle between man and man. Besides, he did not know they were ignorant of Shuffle's character, which was notorious to the whole country. This did not satisfy the other, who taxed him with abetting and assisting the curate's knavery, and insisted on having his share of the winnings returned. This demand the exciseman as positively refused, affirming that, whatever slights Shuffle might practice on other occasions, he was very certain that he had played on the square with them, and would answer it before any bench in Christendom. So saying, he got up, and having paid his reckoning, sneaked off. The landlord, thrusting his neck into the passage to see if he was gone, shook his head, saying, "Ah, Lord help us, if every sinner was to have his deserts. Well, we victuallers must not disoblige the excisemen. But I know what. If Parson Shuffle and he were weighed together, a straw thrown into either scale would make the balance kick the beam. "But, masters, this is under the rose," continued Boniface with a whisper. Chapter 10. The highwayman is taken. We are detained as evidence against him. Proceed to the next village. He escapes. We arrive at another inn, where we go to bed. In the night we are awaked by a dreadful adventure. Next night we lodge at the house of a schoolmaster. Our treatment there, Strap and I were about to depart on our journey, when we perceived a crowd on the road coming towards us, shouting and hallooing all the way. As it approached, we could discern a man on horseback in the middle, with his hands tied behind him, whom we soon knew to be Rifle. The highwayman, not being so well mounted as the two servants who went in pursuit of him, was soon overtaken, and after having discharged his pistols, made prisoner without any further opposition. They were carrying him in triumph, amidst the acclamations of the country people, to a justice of peace in a neighboring village, but stopped at our inn to join their companions and take refreshment. When Rifle was dismounted and placed in the yard, within a circle of peasants, armed with pitchforks, I was amazed to see what a pitiful, dejected fellow he now appeared, who had but a few hours before filled me with such terror and confusion. My companion was so much encouraged by this alteration in his appearance that, going up to the thief, he presented his clenched fists to his nose, and declared he would either cudgel or box with the prisoner for a guinea, which he immediately produced, and began to strip, but was dissuaded from this adventure by me, who represented to him the folly of the undertaking, as Rifle was now in the hands of justice, which would, no doubt, give us all satisfaction enough. But what made me repent of our impertinent curiosity was our being detained by the captors, as evidence against him, when we were just going to set forward. However, there was no remedy. We were obliged to comply, and accordingly joined in the cavalcade, which luckily took the same road that we had proposed to follow. About the twilight we arrived at the place of our destination, but as the justice was gone to visit a gentleman in the country, with whom, we understood, he would probably stay all night, the robber was confined in an empty garret 3 stories high, from which it seemed impossible for him to escape. This, nevertheless, was the case. For next morning, when they went upstairs to bring him before the justice, the bird was flown, having got out at the window upon the roof, from whence he continued his route along the tops of the adjoining houses, and entered another garret where he skulked until the family were asleep, at which time he ventured downstairs and let himself out by the street door, which was open. This event was a great disappointment to those that apprehended him, who were flushed with the hopes of the reward, but gave me great joy, as I was permitted now to continue my journey without any further molestation. Resolving to make up for the small progress we had hitherto made, we this day traveled with great vigor, and before night reached a market town 20 miles from the place from whence we set out in the morning, without meeting any adventure worth notice. Here, having taken up our lodging at an inn, I found myself so fatigued that I began to despair of performing our journey on foot, and desired Strap to inquire if there were any wagon, return horses, or any cheap carriage in this place, to depart for London next day. He was informed that the wagon from Newcastle to London had halted there 2 nights ago, and that it would be an easy matter to overtake it, if not the next day, at farthest, the day after the next. This piece of news gave us some satisfaction, and after having made a hearty supper on hashed mutton, we were shown to our room, which contained 2 beds, the one allotted for us, and the other for a very honest gentleman, who, we were told, was then drinking below. Though we could have very well dispensed with his company, we were glad to submit to this disposition, as there was not another bed empty in the house, and accordingly went to rest, after having secured our baggage under the bolster. About 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I was awaked out of a very profound sleep by a dreadful noise in the chamber, which did not fail to throw me into an agony of consternation when I heard these words pronounced with a terrible voice. "Blood and wounds. Run the halbert into the guts of him that's next you, and I'll blow the other's brains out presently." This dreadful salutation had no sooner reached the ears of Strap than, starting out of bed, he ran against somebody in the dark and overturned him in an instant, at the same time bawling out, "Fire! Murder! Fire!" a cry which in a moment alarmed the whole house and filled our chamber with a crowd of naked people. When lights were brought, the occasion of all this disturbance soon appeared, which was no other than a fellow lodger, whom we found lying on the floor, scratching his head, with a look testifying the utmost astonishment at the concourse of apparitions that surrounded him. This honest gentleman was, it seems, a recruiting sergeant, who, having listed 2 country fellows overnight, dreaded they had mutinied, and threatened to murder him and the drummer who was along with him. This made such an impression on his imagination that he got up in his sleep and expressed himself as above. When our apprehension of danger vanished, the company beheld one another with great surprise and mirth. But what attracted the notice of everyone was our landlady, with nothing on her but her shift and a large pair of buckskin breeches, with the backside before, which she had slipped on in the hurry, and her husband with her petticoat about his shoulders. One had wrapped himself in a blanket, another was covered with a sheet, and the drummer, who had given his only shirt to be washed, appeared in cuipo with a bolster rolled about his middle. When this affair was discussed, everybody retired to his own apartment, the sergeant slipped into bed, and my companion and I slept without any further disturbance till morning, when we got up, went a breakfast, paid our reckoning, and set forward in expectation of overtaking the wagon, in which hope, however, we were disappointed for that day. As we exerted ourselves more than usual, I found myself quite spent with fatigue when we entered a small village in the twilight. We inquired for a public house, and were directed to one of a very sorry appearance. At our entrance, the landlord, who seemed to be a venerable old man with long gray hair, rose from a table placed by a large fire in a very neat paved kitchen, and with a cheerful countenance accosted us in these words: "Salvete, puri. Ingridimini." I was not a little pleased to hear our host speak Latin, because I was in hope of recommending myself to him by my knowledge in that language. I therefore answered without hesitation, "Dissolve frigus ligna super foco, large reponens." I had no sooner pronounced these words than the old gentleman, running towards me, shook me by the hand, crying, "Fili me dauctisime." Unde venis, a superise nigh faller. In short, finding we were both read in the classics, he did not know how to testify his regard enough, but ordered his daughter, a jolly rosy-cheeked damsel who was his sole domestic, to bring us a bottle of his quadrimum, repeating from Horace at the same time, "Diprom quadrimum Sabina, O Tholiarch, marum diota." This was excellent ale of his own brewing, of which he told us he had always an amphora 4 years old, for the use of himself and friends. In the course of our conversation, which was interlarded with scraps of Latin, we understood that this facetious person was a schoolmaster, whose income being small, he was fain to keep a glass of good liquor for the entertainment of passengers, by which he made shift to make the 2 ends of the year meet. "I am this day," said he, "the happiest old fellow in his Majesty's dominions. My wife, rest her soul, is in heaven. My daughter is to be married next week, but the 2 chief pleasures of my life are these," pointing to the bottle and a large edition of Horace that lay on the table. "I am old, 'tis true, what then? The more reason I should enjoy the small share of life that remains, as my friend Flaccus advises. Tu ne quisirus, sire nefas, quem mihi, quem tibi finum dei dederent. Carpe diem, quam minimum credula postero. As he was very inquisitive about our affairs, we made no scruple of acquainting him with our situation, which when he had learned, he enriched us with advices how to behave in the world, telling us that he was no stranger to the deceits of mankind. In the meantime, he ordered his daughter to lay a fowl to the fire for supper, for he was resolved this night to regale his friends, permittens divis caetera. While our entertainment was preparing, our host recounted the adventures of his own life, which, as they contained nothing remarkable, I forbear to rehearse. When we had fared sumptuously, and drunk several bottles of his, I expressed a desire of going to rest, which was with some difficulty complied with, after he had informed us that we should overtake the wagon by noon next day, and that there was room enough in it for half a dozen, for there were only 4 passengers as yet in that convenience. Before my comrade and I fell asleep, we had some conversation about the good humor of our landlord, which gave Strap such an idea of his benevolence that he positively believed we should pay nothing for our lodging and entertainment. "Don't you observe," said he, "that he has conceived a particular affection for us, nay, even treated us at supper with extraordinary fare, which, to be sure, we should not of ourselves have called for?" I was partly of Strap's opinion, but the experience I had of the world made me suspend my belief till the morning, when, getting up betimes, we breakfasted with our host and his daughter on hasty pudding and ale, and desired to know what we had to pay. "Biddy will let you know, gentlemen," said he, "for I never mind these matters. Money matters are beneath the concern of one who lives upon the Horatian plan, crescentum sequitur cura pecuniam." Meanwhile, Biddy, having consulted a slate that hung in the corner, told us our reckoning came to 8s. 7d. 8 shillings and 7 pence, cried Strap. "'Tis impossible." "You must be mistaken, young woman." "Reckon again, child," says her father very deliberately. "Perhaps you have miscounted." "No, indeed," replied she. "I know my business better." I could contain my indignation no longer, but said it was an unconscionable bill, and demanded to know the particulars, upon which the old man got up, muttering, Aye, let us see the particulars, that's but reasonable." And, taking pen, ink, and paper, wrote the following items: to bread and beer 0.6 to a fowl, and sausages 2.6 to 4 bottles of quadrum 2.0 to fire, and tobacco 0.7 to lodging 2.0 to breakfast 1.0. 8.7, as he had not the appearance of a common publican, and had raised a sort of veneration in me by his demeanor the preceding night. It was not in my power to upbraid him as he deserved. Therefore, I contented myself with saying I was sure he did not learn to be an extortioner from Horace. He answered, I was but a young man and did not know the world, or I would not tax him with extortion, whose only aim was to live contentus parvo and keep off importuna pauperies. My fellow traveler could not so easily put up with this imposition, but swore he should either take 1/3 of the money or go without. While we were engaged in this dispute, I perceived the daughter go out, and, conjecturing the occasion, immediately paid the exorbitant demand, which was no sooner done than Biddy returned with 2 stout fellows, who came in on pretense of taking their morning draught, but in reality to frighten us into compliance. Just as we departed, Strap, who was half distracted on account of this piece of expense, went up to the schoolmaster, and, grinning in his face, pronounced with great emphasis, Semper avarice eget. To which the pedant replied with a malicious smile, Animum rege, qui nisi paret imperat.